Hello, this is episode 10 of New Uses for Old Circuits, Feedback Networks in the Style of David Tudor. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that I've been running a record label for a few years with my label partner William Selman called Critique of Everyday Life. It's an experimental label that started more or less as a vehicle for the two of us to put out the kind of music we really wanted to put out, but that other labels probably wouldn't want to sign off on. Bill and I felt that we had a common purpose and were pursuing sort of similar ideas that we didn't really see reflected in the larger music scene. And we wanted to do our kind of academic avant-garde music thing through more of a DIY kind of ethos. And of course, everything we put out is in the glorious format of the CD. We have 4 new releases that we're really thrilled to share this week. One is from Bill. One is from myself under my Emil Zenner name. This collects a lot of Indonesian B-horror soundtracks and combines them with sort of the cybernetic processes that we've been talking about, and also tries to tell an impressionistic historical portrait of Indonesia during the 50s and 60s. And we have another one from our friends Chandler and Dickow, who traced graphic scores using piezoelectric styluses and also used brainwave meters hooked up to EML Electrocomp educational synths from the 70s to create some pretty wild sounds. And finally, we have one from Sam Boston and Sean O'Sullivan, creating a feedback network of analog electronics around a home-built lap steel guitar. You can check those out at the Bandcamp link in the description. So in the last few videos, we've been looking at creating cybernetic feedback systems that are centered around an audio feedback loop, which has a handful of nonlinear functions in the feedback loop, and then creating cybernetic processes outside of that feedback loop that then go back and tame certain aspects of the whole system. The next logical step then, of course, is to expand this into a handful of feedback loops that all feedback on each other, creating a dense feedback network. And that brings us, of course, to the work of David Tudor. David Tudor is one of the most important figures in 20th century music, and yet it seems like the music world still has yet to really grapple with the enormity of his impact. Case in point, probably the single most important work of 20th century music, John Cage's 433, was performed by David Tudor. David Tudor was an incredible piano player and was basically John Cage's chosen partner for realizing Cage's work. Probably one of their signature recorded pieces is this record for Smithsonian Folkways, Indeterminacy, which has John Cage doing readings and David Tudor playing music in a completely different room. But Cage and Tudor didn't really have much interest in recording records and issuing them. Cage, for his part, had some ideological oppositions to recording, which you can find out all about in David Grubbs' book called Recording Ruins the Landscape. Tudor, meanwhile, just didn't really seem to be all that bothered with the idea of issuing records. I think both of them just came from a bit of a different generation. By the time of the 1960s and 70s, the record itself became really the signature medium for you as a musician to present your work. But before then, and especially in the kind of avant-garde circles that they were in, records just weren't as important as live performances or installations. And this brings us, I think, to one of the reasons why I think Tudor is so important of a figure, which was his devotion later in his life in the 80s and 90s to live electronics. Tudor really pushed the boundaries of what live performances could be using electronics, and was doing this at a time when performing live with electronics was nowhere near as ubiquitous as it is today. Further, Tudor was not really all that interested in things like synthesizers. Wesleyan University is home to the David Tudor Archives, which collects all of his so-called Tudor boxes. These would have been objects of various sizes, kind of like this Blippu box here, more or less homemade by Tudor himself. And so his live performances consisted of tabletops of homemade analog electronics. Tudor, more than anything else, was interested in something we've talked a lot about on this channel before, which is the idea of self-organizing sound. Tudor used his Tudor boxes to create dense networks of feedback loops, letting sounds emerge and organize themselves. Now, with someone as influential and important as David Tudor, we could go on for a very long time in this video. And so what I want to do here is just zoom in onto one particular aspect of Tudor's work that is very pertinent to what we've been talking about so far, which is taking feedback loops and nestling them into a dense interconnected web. So let's jump in. So like all the patches we've talked about on this channel, this one is really just a jumping off point, and there are many different ways you can actually realize the central idea. But to sketch it out simply, the idea is what we're going to build here is 3 separate feedback loops full of nonlinear functions, and we're going to simultaneously mix those 3 feedback loops together while feeding them back into all 3 feedback loops. Looking at this through a different lens, this is kind of a neural network model. I talked about neural networks in the previous incarnation of this channel, but basically what we're going to be making here is 3 separate neurons that all influence each other. The basic model of a neuron, called a perceptron, consists of dendrites, which are inputs, to a kind of mixing module that weighs the inputs in different ways. And then this mixing stage is called the soma. And then the output of that mixer goes through a nonlinear function, which is called the axon. And these 3 elements, the inputs, the summation, and the nonlinearity, make up the general idea of a neuron. In fact, David Tudor had a series of pieces he called neural synthesis, which used a huge switching matrix to route signals all over the place through his various Tudor boxes. Anyway, so this time I'm going to try to color code each neuron in different colors. We'll start with yellow, and we'll start with the lower section of the wave multipliers. And what we'll do is we'll run the output of that section into one channel of a mixer, and the output of that mixer back to the input. And so what we're going to hear at first is pretty classic feedback stuff that we've been playing with this whole time. But now what we're going to do is link this single neuron to other neurons in the system. So just to try to make this kind of visually clear, the first neuron is going to be the rectifier and this CV processor mixer here in yellow. The second neuron is going to be the triple wave shaper here, and this is 3 wave shaping stages linked in series. And we'll take the output of that wave shaper and go into this mixer, and we're going to use this mixer as the soma for this neuron, and we'll go from that output back to the input. And while we're here, let's just listen to that one for good measure. And then neuron 3 is going to be this triple wave shaper on the paper face. And for this one, I'm going to have to connect manually the 3 wave shaper stages. So we'll go from the bottom output to the middle input, and the middle output to the top input. And we'll use this dual processor, basically the same as this dual processor, to be our soma for this neuron. So we'll go from the output to the input, and go from the output of that mixer to the input of the bottommost wave shaper. And again, let's listen to this one. So now what we have is 3 neurons acting completely independently, and we could mix them together and listen to it, and it would make a lot of fun noise. But instead, let's tie them all together into an interconnected feedback network. Let's take the output of neuron 1's nonlinearity, which is going to the mixer for neuron 1, and let's also send it to the mixer for neuron 2, as well as sending it to the mixer for neuron 3. Likewise, let's take the output for the nonlinearity in neuron 2 and send it to the mixer for neuron 1, and the mixer for neuron 3. And finally, we'll take the output from the nonlinearity of neuron 3 and go to the input for the mixer of neuron 1 and the mixer for neuron 2. So now all 3 of our neurons are completely mixed up and feeding back on each other. Let's take their nonlinearities and mix them together in an audio mixer over here on the paper face. And I'll use these orange cables for our combined audio output. And of course, if you know me, you know that I'm going to take this mixer output and run it through the resonant, equalizer. And I'll do the trick that I always love doing, which is to give a sort of sense of stereo space to this. I take the 2 comb filter outputs of the Res EQ and run them into the stereo mixer and pan them left, and right. So what we have here is a really interesting and playable feedback system. We're just changing the amounts in the mixers, and especially when using the CV processors as mixers, being able to invert some of the signals gives us a wide range of control over this feedback ecosystem. I use the word control, but that's not really the right word. I don't really have much control over the system. I have the illusion of control, and I can guide certain things, but it's the system itself, the circuits themselves, that are organizing themselves into these different sounds. This is the principle of self-organization. Now, of course, one tool that I don't have in this system that would make this a lot cleaner is a matrix mixer, and that's something that Tudor used extensively, basically to do this kind of thing. You can see immediately how using a matrix mixer cleans up a lot of this wiring. But I think for demonstration purposes, having the mixers separate is kind of nice, and it also makes the whole thing a bit web-like and kind of confusing, which is really nice. One thing Tudor used a lot in addition to matrix mixers was phasers, and you can start to see how inserting phasers into different parts of this feedback network will start to make things even more interesting. Let's take, for example, this connection and run it through this phaser, and I'll take the 1080 degree output and go back to this input. And let's take this connection and go into this one, and we'll use the 720 degree input to go back to our mixer. Another thing I want to do is start to fold in some of our cybernetic ideas. Let's take various outputs and run them through slew generators to slow them down and fold them back into various parts of our feedback network. Still trying to keep these things color-coded. Let's use gray cables for some of these things. So let's take, for example, this output of the wave shaper, go through a slope generator, and then throw that output into this bias control of the first neuron. Let's take this DC output from that neuron and go into a different slope generator. And let's send that over here to one of the voltage control inputs on this wave shaper. And let's take this output and go through a negative slew, and let's send that into one of the phasers. Another thing I want to do that's quite tutory is take one of these outputs, let's say the output from this mixer, and run it through a preamp. That's all the way over here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's the surge preamp, and this is going to add a shit ton of gain to the signal. So I'm going to patch all of this in red and insert this super overblown signal various places within the network and see what happens. Did you expect the sound to blow up? I kind of did too, but that's the fun with all this feedback patching. You never really know what's going to happen. Now, while I really love these raw sounds, some of you have asked how to use these sounds in more musical ways. So let's basically run these three paths that we have here through three separate filters and see how those fillers can color and resonate the sound before it hits the Res EQ. So we'll take the yellow path and go through this filter here, and let's use bandpass filters for all of them. We'll take the blue path here and go through this filter, again using the bandpass output. And the white path we will send through the variable Q filter up here. And again, take the bandpass output. And let's hear what happens.